It's a great honor to be here and to be invited, and of course lovely to be in Siena. Okay, so I'm going to talk about natural minds, artificial minds, and simulated minds, what I mean by that, and exactly what my controversial theses are will become clear, I hope. By minds, I mean this mind talk can be rather confusing. I don't mean anything fancy. It's just a way of talking about creatures with mental states, and specifically conscious creatures. And by creatures, I don't just mean biological creatures, I mean entities of any kind. So if there are such things as, or could be such things as conscious robots or androids, then they're included as conscious creatures. Okay, so natural minds are minds found in nature, and of course there's some disagreement about which of the many creatures found in nature on the slide have minds or are conscious, but it should be uncontroversial that at least some of them do. And by artificial minds, I mean minds that are artifacts. In other words, conscious creatures that are created or built by some agent or agents. And simulated minds are minds that are produced by simulations. I'll have a lot more to say about that as we go on. Okay, so no natural minds are artificial or simulated. I mean, assuming we aren't living in a simulation. I'll also come on to that later. But simulations are artifacts, a particular kind of artifact. So all simulated minds are artificial minds. So we may diagram the situation like this. There are the natural minds, and then some disjoint set of artificial minds. Of course, we can dispute just what is in the set of natural minds. We can dispute just what is in the set of artificial minds. Maybe one could think that nothing whatsoever is in the set of artificial minds. The set of artificial minds is empty. In any event, a subset of the set of artificial minds will be the simulated minds, if indeed there could be any. Okay, so some uncontroversial theses are some minds are natural, at least for the, as philosophers say, for the sake of the argument, we may assume that most of the people in this room are actually conscious. So some minds are natural. Some minds could be artificial, because we could build a human-like creature from biological materials, and ignoring Davidsonian swamp man-style worries, that human-like creature would have a mind, I would be conscious. And Eric gave an example of that in his talk when he had the example of Calvin duplicating himself. And there, of course, the assumption was that the duplicate Calvin, being a biological replica of the actual Calvin, would also have a mind. And it should also be uncontroversial that some minds could be simulated, but this is not a terribly interesting thesis, as I will go on to explain. In the limit, a man-made X can serve as a simulation of an X. So, assuming that duplicate Calvin is conscious, a man-made conscious being could serve as a simulation of the conscious being, namely Calvin. And it would be rather pointless doing simulations that way. We normally produce simulations because they're much more efficient and cheaper and quicker than experimenting on anything like the real thing. That's also something I'll get onto later. But still, there's no reason to deny that some unhelpful simulations are really exactly like the real thing that they're simulating. Okay, so here are some controversial theses. As I said, it's controversial just where consciousness stops and unconsciousness starts in the animal kingdom. In particular, it's controversial whether ants have minds. I've no idea why I chose ants, but anyway. It's also controversial whether large language models like ChatGPT have minds, or whether some suitably sophisticated version of them, ChatGPT N for some N, has a mind. And it's also controversial whether we could be simulated minds ourselves, living in a simulation. Okay, so here's my controversial take on these controversial theses. So yes to ants have minds. No to large language models have or will have minds. And I'm a bit of a negative glass half full kind of guy, so it's no also to we could be simulated minds living in a simulation. Of course, that view was not exactly defended, but entertained very seriously by David Chalmers in a recent book called Reality Plus. Okay, so let's start with animals. So we're in Italy, so every presentation has to quote from some famous Italian, and I chose Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas wasn't keen on ant minds himself, or even oxen minds. Dumb animals and plants are devoid of the life of reason whereby to set themselves in motion. He that kills another's ox sins not through killing the ox, but through injuring another man in his property. Wherefore, this is not a species of the sin of murder, but rather of the sin of theft or robbery. And Descartes, this is quoted in Michael Tighe's book, Tense Bees and Shell-Shocked Crabs. It seems reasonable, since art copies nature and men can make various automata that move without thought, that nature should produce its own automata, much more splendid than the artificial ones. These natural automata are the animals. So an ant for Descartes, as well as something much more elaborate like a dog, is just a fancy piece of mindless clockwork. So one approach to animal minds is exemplified by Tighe. He extracts from Newton this principle: the causes assigned to natural effects of the same kind must be, as far as possible, the same. I think that's actually a quote from Newton, and then Tighe paraphrases the point as follows: if a cause is assigned to an effect of a given kind, then if you assign different causes to other effects of that kind, then you're introducing superfluous causes, and this is methodologically ill-advised. So Tighe uses this principle to argue that lots of animals, including insects, in fact, have minds. But it soon becomes extremely controversial because, on the one hand, you have to argue that animals like bees and ants have the same kind of effects as those exemplified in creatures like ourselves. That is, in some sense, we behave alike. And then you have to argue that, okay, well, given that we behave alike, the causes are the same, namely they're psychological in us, so they're psychological in bees and ants. And then Tighe is obviously alive to the fact that these principles always have exceptions or escape clauses. They're always defeaters for the claim that, oh, well, because the behavior is exactly the same, therefore the cause must be exactly the same. And so here things get extremely complicated because the inner workings of many animals, in particular insects, are very much like the inner work, very much unlike the inner workings of creatures like ourselves. So insect brains are very different from mammal brains, for example. So it all becomes very complicated and contentious. But I think we can take a considerably simpler tack just by thinking about perception. So we aren't the only perceivers by any means. Ants perceive. We can just restrict attention to visual perception. Ants see, so do tigers, and so do mantis shrimp. That's uncontroversial. And perceptual states, if you wanted a paradigm of a conscious state, it would be a perceptual state. So here's Frank Jackson's black and white Mary being released from her black and white cell and seeing a red object for the first time. It's no coincidence that Jackson chose a perceptual state to illustrate his point. Similarly, it's no coincidence that when Nagel wrote about what it's like to be a bat, he chose the bat's perceptual capacities to illustrate his points about consciousness. And indeed, it's even controversial whether there is such a thing as unconscious perception. So, obviously, Nick Humphrey is on one side of this debate, Ian Phillips is on another side of this debate, particularly insofar as it concerns blind sight. So one claim about blind sight that Ian defends is that it isn't unconscious vision, it's just degraded conscious vision. In any event, blind sight does seem to be a special case. It's not the normal run of things as far as perception goes. There's no reason to think that other animals functioning normally have anything like blind sight. There's no reason to think that some animals, even if we grant that blind sight is genuinely unconscious vision, so there's no reason to think that some animals evolved conscious perception while others got by with the allegedly unconscious kind. And ants, just by the way, are really remarkably sophisticated creatures. I don't know whether this 2015 study has been replicated or not, but there's some evidence that ants can pass the mirror self-recognition test. So if you paint a blue dot on the plate between their eyes, they'll try and rub it off when they look in a mirror. In any case, as Darwin said, the brain of an ant, he was very impressed by ants. The brain of an ant is one of the most marvelous atoms of matter in the world, perhaps more marvelous than the brain of man. Okay, well, that was a bit quick. I should warn you, since I have 3 controversial conclusions, all the arguments will be a bit quick, but rest assured, the missing premises can all be explained during the question period. Okay, so ants have minds. That's the first claim. Now, what about ChatGPT? So you may remember this story. In 2022, Google supposedly fired one of its engineers who claimed that Google's AI was conscious. The engineer, Blake Lemoine, contends that the company's language model has a soul. The company denies that and says he violated its security policies. Of course, this is just meat and drink to any conspiracy-minded person. I mean, obviously the AI has a soul and Google is trying to cover it up. Okay, so there's a great, there are so many great videos on YouTube in general, and there are lots of great videos about large language models and how they work. And one really good one is by this guy, Andrej Karpathy. And this is his summary slide on how to train your chat GPT. And it's got two stages. So the first stage is that you download like the entire internet, basically. Well, he's got 10 terabytes of text. I think a terabyte is something like, it's supposed to be the equivalent of 1,000 copies of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And 10 terabytes, at least now, I can't remember how old this video is, 10 terabytes is actually a bit on the low side. I think the latest version of ChatGPT is more like 40 terabytes. But anyway, when you've got your text, you then get a cluster of these fancy parallel graphics processing units, and you pay some millions of dollars, and then you get this base model. And then the next stage, fine-tuning, is where the humans come in, and they rate rate various responses given by the base model, and eventually that turns the base model into ChatGPT as we know and love it. That is something that's capable of dialogue, of answering questions and responding to commands and writing a sonnet in the style of Shakespeare, or writing your term paper, or indeed writing your philosophy lecture in Siena. This entire lecture was written by ChatGPT, I should say. Okay, well, I think one of the interesting things he says in this video just concerns the base model. And of course, it's the last stage when you can converse with the thing that really gives you the impression that you're talking to a conscious agent. But the base model is sort of impressive enough. And the way he describes it is that it dreams internet documents. So of course, it's all about next word prediction. That's what these things do. They try and predict the next word. And so you can seed it with just one word and let it go. It will just carry on producing text. And you can think of it as, Karpathy says, as the model dreaming internet documents. So on the left, you have a Java code dream, so you seed it with some Java code text, and it produces a whole bunch of JavaScript. The one in the middle is what seems to be an Amazon product dream. That is the sort of list of information that you find on the website Amazon. And the third one is a Wikipedia article dream. It's a more or less coherent Wikipedia-style article about a fish called the black-nosed dace. Actually, I'm not even sure if there is a fish called the black-nosed dace, so maybe it's an entirely fictional dream about a fictional fish. But in any event, the point is that, I mean, this isn't like particularly crucial to the argument, but I think it's interesting to think about. It's actually hard to see why the question and answer capacity, which you get after you have your base model, is really necessary for the model to be conscious. I mean, this is impressive enough. The dreaming is impressive enough. Why isn't that? You can either have the dreaming ChatGPT, which is of course no use, or you can have the question and answer ChatGPT, which is extremely useful. But why would you think, if you're inclined to think that the question and answer ChatGPT is conscious, why wouldn't you think that the dreaming version is conscious as well? Anyway, of course, there's a lot of excitement over these large language models, and lots of philosophers Chalmers being one of them actually, take the idea that they might be conscious very seriously. But I really, I don't know, maybe I'm getting old or something, but I really don't see that there's any plausibility whatsoever to the idea that ChatGPT is or could be conscious. So here are just some kind of elementary points. So the first thing is that LLMs they're purely linguistic entities. Right? All they do is talk or dream in language. That's all they do. They don't act or, sniff around or open their eyes. They don't have any eyes. They're nothing remotely like any animal or even any space alien. And as far as language goes, of course, we know a lot about language. I mean, one thing we know is that actual language acquisition requires perception. No, language, of course, is a very specialized cognitive capacity, more or less unique to human beings. It's certainly not representative of mentality across or cognitive capacities across the animal kingdom, but it requires perception. Of course, you'll know if you have children that the only way to teach them language is to draw their attention to perceptually salient things in their environment. And maybe more importantly, if you look at creatures with linguistic capacities, then that seems to be always built on this foundation of psychology. So you can degrade someone's linguistic capacities quite drastically while sparing a huge amount of their psychology. You can't degrade someone's psychology leaving only their linguistic capacities intact. If you lose language, which unfortunately happens to a number of people, that certainly doesn't mean that all your psychological capacities have gone with it. But of course, with large language models, that's just not true at all. The linguistic capacity is simply the only thing they have. So, of course, this is not a knockdown argument by any means, but I think it's enough to be extremely skeptical, the idea that we have anything more than a very convincing illusion, at least when it comes to the ChatGPT version with the question and answer capacity, a very convincing illusion of a mind, not a mind at all. So it's just the return of Blockhead all over again. Ned Block's Blockhead. This is actually not the title of the book edited by Adam Poutz and Daniel Stoljar, but it's kind of close. I modified it slightly. Anyway, if you don't know what Blockhead is, ask me during the question period. But anyway, it seems that, in a way, not much has been learnt in the intervening years, as far as I can see. Okay, so that's my answer to the second question. Large language models don't have minds and never will. So what about the third question? Well, this is the one you've all been waiting for. So this is Elon Musk on the extremely popular podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, explaining why we very likely live in a simulation. So I think it says at the top left in rather small type, we are most likely in a simulation. That is Elon Musk's view. Okay, so well, let's think about simulations for a bit. So here are some simulations. The one on the left is a simulation of the planets, or at least the planets that were known at the time. It's a mechanical simulation. It's called an orrery, and if you turn the handle, then the planets will spin around the sun in something like the actual manner that the real planets turn around the sun. In the middle is a graphical representation of a computer simulation of some weather event. And then we've got a couple of other simulations, not computer simulations, on the right, a model ship in a real tank of water, simulating some perhaps to-be-built gigantic container ship, and then some crash test dummies used to simulate how the human body will react in some car collision. So there are three kinds of simulation. Dave's book, Reality Plus, is excellent for making distinctions of these kinds. There are the non-computational kinds of simulation, which we might call physical or mechanical. Then there's the purely computational kind, where the simulation just consists in running some computer program or another. And then there are mixed simulations. Computational plus extra physical components may be controlled by computations. The S is cut off because I converted Keynote, which is the presentation program everyone should be using, to PowerPoint, which no one should be using. Just like to get that off my chest. Anyway, this is the NASA low gravity simulator, which is a mixed simulation. Got lots of computing in it. Oh, okay, I have 5 minutes left. Yikes. Okay, here's a point from Searle. No one supposes that computer simulations of a 5-alarm fire will burn the neighborhood down, or that a computer simulation of a rainstorm will leave us all drenched. That is a perfectly good point. One thing to add to Searle's point is that, of course, that doesn't hold for all simulations. So the simulation of the container ship in the water really does use real water and also a real, albeit very small, boat. Okay, so in the abstract, we can characterize simulations this way. If X is the simulation that is simulated, and S of X is a simulation of X, which is typically smaller, simpler, cheaper, faster than X. And in the special case, which is, actually it's not really the special case, the typical case, the dynamic case, the system X evolves over time. It has different features at different times. And essentially, I won't bother going over the details. The idea is that the simulation mirrors the thing to be simulated with respect to one or another features that we're interested in of the thing to be simulated. So you can read off the simulation, you can read off S of X, what the relevant features of the simulated thing, X, will be at various times. And here's Dave suggesting that we will have to take seriously the idea that simulated brains are themselves conscious and intelligent. One day we may construct reasonably accurate simulations of human brains and behavior. Maybe some of those simulated brains will be conscious. And he says at one point in the book that a perfect simulation can be defined as one that precisely mirrors the world it's simulating. And I'd just like to make the point that, I mean, that's a perfectly a good way of explaining what a perfect simulation is, but that doesn't mean, contra Dave on the last slide, that the simulation and the simulated behave exactly alike, because a perfect simulation of a bouncing point particle, one that's implemented in a computer, for example, need not do any bouncing. And then self-simulation, I touched on this at the very start. Usually the simulation of X, S of X, is neither X nor it's a perfect replica. A crash test dummy is not a human. Computer simulation of a rainstorm is not a rainstorm. But it's entirely reasonable to take the limiting case where S of X is X, or a duplicate of X, to be a simulation. And in that case, the simulated and the simulatee will behave exactly alike. And the orrery makes the point that a simulation of X needn't duplicate the causal relations between elements of X. Okay, so now very quickly, a few more minutes. Here's the basic idea, which comes from a famous paper of Nick Bostrom's, that in the glorious transhuman future, our descendants will be making all these simulated minds. They will vastly outnumber the number of physical minds. So the non-simulated beings will be dwarfed by the vast number of simulated beings. And then the worry is supposed to be, gosh, well, you know, if I'm like playing the odds, it seems more likely than not that I'm a simulated being. And Chalmers, for complicated reasons we needn't get into, doesn't go that far, but he thinks the chance we're simulated beings in a simulated universe is at least 25% or so. Okay, but then crucially, why would a human-like simulation be conscious? And the argument given in the book is just a replacement argument. The simulated self, so basically we're massively oversimplifying the neuroscience, just for the sake of the argument. Just imagine the brain is just it's just this gigantic wiring diagram made up of neurons, like that's all there is to it. And we imagine replacing one neuron with a simulation of a neuron where the simulation has exactly the same input-output profile as the neuron that we're replacing. And we do that one at a time gradually. Something like this will happen at every stage. That is, you'll keep saying you're conscious at every stage. Dave turns that into an argument that at the end of the replacement, consciousness will be preserved. Let's just grant that. At least in the special case in which you become a simulated brain by gradual uploading, the simulation will be fully conscious. Okay, so I'm almost done. So the replacement argument, first, it does not assume that mental processes are computational. It's an argument that gradually transforming the biological connectome into a causally equivalent synthetic one would preserve consciousness. And note that the whole argument keeps the rest of the organism's physical body and its environment constant. So the further assumptions need to be made in order to get the conclusion that there could be an entirely simulated being, including simulated body and so on, that was conscious. Let's generously assume that that is correct. We'll assume that a bodiless synthetic connectome would be conscious. But a perfect simulation of a biological connectome running on some supercomputer is not thereby a synthetic connectome. Because the whole point of the synthetic connectome is that it completely duplicates the causal relations that obtain in the actual biological connectome in our heads. And this is just an entirely general point, which we've already been over. A computer simulation of some complicated causal process need not itself, even a perfect simulation of that causal process, need not itself duplicate or instantiate that causal process itself. So a perfect computer simulation of the motion of the planets doesn't duplicate the causal relations between the planets any more than the mechanical orrery duplicates the causal relations between the planets. And even if we just grant that our post-human descendants will be very much interested in perfectly simulating human brains on planetary-sized computers, there's no reason to think that those computer simulations will duplicate the causal structure of the human connectome, even if they are perfect computer simulations of it. So in order to perfectly simulate brains on planetary-sized supercomputers, our post-human descendants don't need to make synthetic connectomes, so they don't need to make minds. So no to we could be simulated minds living in a simulation. So summing up, ants have minds, large language models don't, and I'm sure you're greatly relieved to discover that we aren't living in a simulation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. So the topic of my talk today is corporate mind and altruistic intention, or rather corporate altruism. So I'm interested in the idea why corporate altruism gathers so much negative reaction, and how we can think about it in the context of corporate or group mind. So, like, as an anecdotal evidence, every time I tell someone that I work on corporate altruism, the first question I encounter is like, whether such thing exists, and that very thing happened yesterday with me again. And corporations today, they engage in a wide variety of initiatives that can be considered altruistic. Yet critics may argue that corporation never help anyone sincerely and it's just a clever PR for them. So, do critics mean that the corporations intend to deceive us? Do they mean it metaphorically, or that the corporation have their own mind and they really intend to deceive us when they engage in these corporate social responsibility activities? And how we can explain corporate altruism without postulating corporate mind, and in the same time without being purely individualistic. And I will show that it's interesting that the question of whether group mind exists or not is relevant to the question how we explain corporate altruism and whether we should be skeptical about it. So the plan for the presentation, I'll just explain what corporate altruism is, provide you with some real-life examples, critical position, explain why individualistic solution dissolve the problem and doesn't make it philosophically interesting. Then I'll talk about, I just realized that probably that was too high for me. Then I will explain why I don't want to go with functionalism, explaining group mind, and then provide an account of group action without group mind, and then explain how we can apply this account to corporate altruism. So corporate altruism refers to voluntary actions taken by corporations to benefit society or the environment without direct financial gain or profit motive. So it encompasses a wide variety of activities, starting from charitable donations and ethical business practices and also community support, and etc. So if you followed business literature, you will see you will probably encounter such notions as corporate social responsibility, ESG, SDG, and etc. For some theoretical reasons, I prefer the term corporate altruism because it neatly it's easy to discuss it together with individual altruism, unlike corporate social responsibility thing, which hard to talk about on the individual level. So we can talk about individual altruism, but we can hardly talk about individual corporate social responsibility. Doesn't make much sense. So corporate altruism is a big thing in business world, starting with business education, and then in the business practices, you can see that how corporations, they actually present their altruistic efforts in their websites, in the career, in the career fairs, in the offices. So like in the photos, you can see a logo of Trinity Business School, transforming business for good. So one of their goals is to like educate new generation of business leaders who are concerned about sustainability, communities, social impact of their business, etc. Another photo with the big word zero, it's a photo I took in Citibank office, and zero means that they aim for zero hunger, zero payment gap, zero gender payment gap, zero emission, etc. So there's also a concept of sustainable development goals, and many companies explain which sustainable development goals they took on themselves, and whether they aim for ending world hunger, world, injustice, etc. So this is a very big thing in the business world. And there are companies who build their kind of public picture around being positive for society, and Unilever is one of such companies, and the founder of the Unilever, he wrote the whole book about that. Another example is just from Coca-Cola company website. One of their social initiatives is they want to provide access to safe drinking water and sanitation, and they already helped more than 18 million people. So the thing exists, there is no doubt about it. What critics usually focus on is the motivation behind it. So there is like lots of literature on that. Some critics say that corporations are designed to be profit-seeking entities. Their CSR efforts are often just a way to gain public favor and shield themselves from criticism without making real change to their exploitative practices. Or some critics present corporations as ethical monsters. So Noam Chomsky, left intellectual, he said that corporations, they are obliged to be ethical monsters, and if they do not behave like this, this is probably illegal. And it's interesting that in this respect, people from the right of political spectrum, they agree with the people from the left. Left think that corporations use philanthropy to improve their image without kind of going for real social change. And people on the right, Milton Friedman and those who like him, they think that social corporate responsibility is just a harmful concept, and the only responsibility corporations have is before their shareholders to increase their profits. In another quotation, corporate social responsibility is too often just a superficial and cynical public relations exercise, distract from need for real systematic change, and shield companies from facing their negative impacts on society and environment. And like when I read all this criticism, I'm thinking like, okay, if corporations, they do all this charity just to improve their public image, they do a terrible work. Like corporate world usually seen like in a very bad light. And it's like, it doesn't work. And if it were and what's interesting to me is like, why sincerity is like such a hot debated thing? Like, why we think that corporations specifically are not sincere in their charitable efforts. So I will discuss three approaches to this question. So individualists, I see a typo, but whatever. So some people will say that there are no corporations, it's just a metaphor for individuals, and I will discuss what follows from that for corporate altruism. There is approach from the corporate mind perspective. Corporate altruism is a corporate action caused by corporate mental states. And another approach, middle ground approach, which I would argue for, is that corporate altruism is caused by corporate reasons through individual employees who act on them. The sincerity depends on the kind of corporate reasons which causes the altruistic behavior, and that's basically my position. So, individualistic solution to the problem of corporate altruism sincerity. So there is long-standing debate about whether group agents like corporations exist and whether they are capable of any kind of actions whatsoever. The question of corporate altruism is philosophically interesting when we presuppose that corporate agents exist in some sense and are capable of at least some actions. If this is not the case and all group actions can be reduced to individual actions, then the question becomes much more trivial. Most of us presuppose that people are capable of sincerely helping others and sometimes exercise this ability, including those who work for corporation. So altruism on the individual level is not kind of mystery, even though people routinely are skeptical about other people doing something sincerely, especially helping others. But we do not talk about it as like a fundamental problem for individual altruism. And the literature on individual altruism rather presupposes that we are evolutionary presupposed to kind of altruism from time to time, and especially when we are sufficiently developed, cognitively developed people. So for anyone who talks about corporations metaphorically and presuppose that they are merely sum of individual actions and nothing more ontologically, the question then shifts to a broader one, whether people ever act sincerely when they are engaged in corporate altruism. We assume the answer to this question is positive. People can do this. Alternatively, if we don't agree that people can, be altruistic when they work for corporation, it could become very specific question about the nature of corporate employees, whether corporate world deforms them to the extent that they never act sincerely. And this is very kind of strong hypothesis to make, that if person starts to work for a corporation, then he eventually stop being altruistic whatsoever. And I have to, reading all the literature on the topic, I noticed that there is not many books where they argue, actually I haven't seen any, that people who are engaged in altruism, philanthropy, etc. on individual level, that they all are just liars and they pretend. So we naturally tend to be much more, we trust people more than we trust corporations. So there could be questions about motives of individual person, but on the general level, when we think about philanthropy, we tend to think that people who do philanthropy, they do it because, most of them want to do this, and not just because they want to improve their public image, even though the latter, of course, could be the case, as well as with corporations. So my takeaway with individualistic approach is that if you don't believe that corporations exist whatsoever, and you think that it's just individuals, then there is no specific there is no specifically interesting question about that for you. Because philosophically, it would be just a question whether people can act altruistically, sincerely, or not. And this is kind of old question, and I would rather say that consensus is that people can be altruistic. Another way to approach this thing is to go for fully fledged corporate mind. The opposite of individualism approach postulates that groups exist and they have mind. Their mental states, corporate mental states cause their actions. For genuine corporate altruism, there should be a desire to help and some beliefs about how to achieve it. And we also can, we can take causal theory of action and apply it to corporations with a group mind. And then it would look like this. Like any behavioral event of an agent S is an action if and only if S Aing is caused in the right way and causally explained by some appropriate non-functional mental events that mediates or constitute S's reasons for Aing. So for corporation to do something, like to help someone, is they do this only if they have mental states which kind of causally which explains or constitute, not constitute, explain their action. The thing is, the problem with this approach is that it presupposes, like most of the theoretics who argue for group mind, they go with functionalism about group minds. And many theories of group mind would not explain well the group actions. Many theories of group mind would not explain well group mind. What I mean, like we have to go with functionalism because other theories of mind, we can hardly apply them to explain group mentality. What I mean is that it's hard to think about dualism as a theory which explains group mind. You know, like we don't seriously think there is corporations have immaterial soul which somehow cause them to act. Also, we wouldn't go with mind-brain identity theory because corporations, they don't have mind. And so these approaches to mind, they do not explain would not explain how group mind is possible, even though some philosophers trying to do so, but they are in minority. And those who go for group mind, those who agree that group mind exists, they go for functionalism. I will not explain to this to you what functionalism is. I think you either know it or you already got lost in my presentation. The problem with functionalism is that most compelling cases against functionalism are cases involving group minds. In block thought experiments, we are told to imagine citizens of the Chinese nation organized to instantiate the same patterns of interactions as the firing of neurons in an individual. Block took it as a prima facie intuitive that the group does not instantiate qualitative states, for example, pain. No wonder then that the opponents are not convinced, they are being asked to, opponents of group mind are not convinced, they are asked to accept functionalism in cases similar to those that led them to be skeptical of group mind in the first place. So why I think functionalism is not, and I follow Candace Silver in this regard, why I think that functionalism is not a great way to explain group mentality is because we usually use examples of group instantiating mental functions as argument against functionalism. So then to accept functionalism to explain group minds seems kind of counterintuitive for me. So the account I want to have is that it admits that groups exist, otherwise there would be no interesting phenomenon to talk about it if there are only individuals. The second thing is that I want account that explains why except that there is no group mind. And third, I want to account that kind of explain how corporations can act on altruistic reasons. So here I follow again Kenneth Silver in his account, where he argues that group actions can be understood without attributing mental states to the group itself. Instead, he suggests that groups can act based on reasons similar on how individuals do, but facilitated by group members. So group action is the action of corporate members based on the corporate reasons. The current debate may be focused on whether groups have mental states. However, mental states may only matter to action insofar as they allow agent to respond to reasons and explain her actions in terms of them. And then there is advanced causal theory of actions, which basically is saying that action is something when agent act on reasons. So, possibility of corporate altruism. Can corporate employees be motivated by corporate reasons? Can corporations have reasons to genuinely care about others? And how can we know what is the case in any given situation on case-by-case study? I have like 2 slides left. So, altruistic reasons. Genuine corporate altruism within Silver's framework would be described as follows. The corporations engage in actions intended to benefit society or specific stakeholders without any expectation of direct or immediate financial return. The reasons behind these actions are genuinely altruistic, and the corporate members who facilitate these actions believe are motivated by these altruistic reasons. And like there are empirical studies saying that corporate executives do believe that they have duty for society. I'll skip this slide. And then I'll skip this slide. Yeah, corporations, they have structures described by French and often adhere to well-documented procedures or protocoled orders that are observable. These are observable unlike subjective phenomenal thought, making it feasible to verify stated objectives, policies, or actions. So I just provide a list of goals which can be written into corporate documents, and these goals can can serve as motivational reasons for corporate employees to act upon them. And this is very much realistic realistic thing that happens, and which explain how corporate moral altruism is possible. And the whole debate basically is whether corporations also provide other reasons for their employees to act, not on these reasons, but for the sake of PR, etc. And I believe that at best, not at best, either corporate employees, when they engage in corporate altruism, they either act sincerely on these reasons, or their motivational set can be mixed, and they can also have like other business like considerations in mind when they engage in corporate altruism. But neither mixed reasons or sincerity is kind of, from neither of these positions follow that corporate altruism is a decoy or PR all the time. So my conclusion is that it's very much possible that corporations sincerely engage in corporate altruism. However, from everything I said, it doesn't follow that this is a good way to solve our social problems and whether this thing is effective, because this is a topic for another presentation. Thank you.
The title of my talk is Conscious Engagement with Artificial Intelligence, Three Forms of Transparency. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the notion of transparency in the context of the extended mind debate. I want to talk then about artificial intelligence and the whole question about our own autonomy, not the autonomy of the artificial system, but our own autonomy. And then I'll turn to some examples with respect to artificial intelligence guiding psychotherapy. So the model of extended cognition introduces the idea that tools, artifacts, and technologies can enhance our cognitive performance and our social interactions. Okay. Such technical extensions can not only enhance cognition and social interactions, but they can also constrain or distort such processes. They can help us or they might hinder us. So the critical point is that technology, in any case, is not neutral. In effect, technologies can change our minds. That is, literally, they can change the way that we perceive the world or change the way that we think about things. There are technologies, for example, that get incorporated or integrated as they extend our cognitive processes. They get, so to speak, inside our heads, or they allow us to go outside of our heads, if you are an extended minder, in ways that can expand our cognitive possibilities or constrain our abilities to even recognize problems. This idea of being incorporated into our own system is sometimes referred to as a kind of transparency. So transparency is the idea that we can smoothly or fluently incorporate tools and technologies into our cognitive system to the extent that they work without conscious effort. They become what Heidegger would call ready to hand and are not themselves the object of our attention. Clark and others like Thompson and Stapleton, Wheeler, they all argue that experiential or phenomenal transparency is necessary for cognitive extension. Mike Wheeler, for example, contends that when an external resource is transparent or incorporated, a necessary condition is met for its constitutive incorporation into the user's mental machinery. Thompson and Stapleton argue that transparency means that a device is no longer experienced as an object, and the world is rather experienced through the technology. A nice example is given by Wheeler. This technology used to be called NorthSense. It's now called Sentero. And what it is, it's a small wearable piece of technology that vibrates gently when it faces magnetic north. As Wheeler explains it, first-person reports suggest that Sentero, he says, quickly becomes deeply integrated into the wearer's cognitive life. Most strikingly, orientation and position start to play a bigger than usual role in the structuring of memory. So this not only gives us a kind of extra perceptual sense, but it also starts to have an effect upon our memory. This is an example of a technology, I think, that quickly becomes experientially transparent or incorporated, so that the agent gets directly to the experience or to the task without noticing the technology. So experiential transparency can be important for a technology, but experiential transparency is not the only kind of transparency. There's also something called epistemic transparency. Epistemic transparency is something like this, that we have epistemic transparency if we know precisely how the technology works, not just how to work it, how to plug it in and to push a button, but how it actually functions, how it does what it does. And this can also be distinguished from a third type of transparency, which I'm calling hermeneutic transparency. Hermeneutic transparency is when we have an understanding of what the technology does to us. So not just how it works, but what it's doing to us, affecting our memory, for example. So technology is often experientially transparent, but epistemically and hermeneutically opaque. And I think Sentaro might be a good example of this. So here are some examples. A blind man's cane, which is a very simple technology, let's say. Experientially, epistemically, and hermeneutically, it seems very transparent what it does, how it works, and so forth. And it gets fully incorporated, so it attains experiential transparency when you are habituated to it and it serves its function. Sentaro, going back to that technology, I think is experientially transparent, but epistemically and hermeneutically opaque. It gets fully fully incorporated, but then we don't really understand perhaps how it works, and we don't really understand what it is doing to our memory. An example of exoskeletal technology, if you're familiar with that, it would be experientially opaque, but epistemically and hermeneutically transparent. And the final would be Microsoft software, which is experientially opaque, epistemically opaque, and hermeneutically troublesome. That's a joke. Okay. In any case, in that second instance, in say the technology of Sentaro, that could be a dangerous type of situation. Just such kinds of technologies may be open to manipulation by others, which would pose a threat to our autonomy and perhaps to privacy. So I want to move on to the autonomy problem. Consider the use of deep learning artificial intelligence systems in devices that, for example, classify information in ways that are not consistent with the classificatory norms that human agents typically use. We would get some kind of distortion in our cognitive processes, possibly robbing us of our autonomy. Here's an example from Sergey, who provides this simple example using images of cars. The system maximizes the network's prediction error, and artificial networks can then misclassify an image with a slight, the image which would have a slight imperceptible difference. It's imperceptible to us, but somehow the artificial system picks out some difference. One image then that looks exactly the same as the other image is classified as a car, and the other image is classified as a non-car. This is referred to as adversarial negatives. And the issue here is that we don't understand how often this occurs or why it occurs. And then we can start thinking about maybe those instances that we hear about in the press, in the media, about the classification of humans along race and gender lines, or the misclassification of humans in that way. The use of such technology may mean the might meet the experiential transparency requirement, but it is neither epistemically nor hermeneutically transparent, insofar as the agent does not fully understand how the algorithm works and is unaware that the technology may be changing his mind in unwanted ways. Here's what Mike Wheeler has to say about this. This outcome would surely have epistemic implications, and perhaps moral ones, too. If a deep neural network application to which I am transparently coupled qualifies as part of my cognitive architecture and thus as part of me, then the classification in question, classifications that unconsciously guide my behavior, will be part of what I unconsciously believe to be the case, and thus presumably will have the same status as my more familiar, internally realized unconscious beliefs when it comes to any moral judgments that are made about my resulting thoughts and actions. Okay. In such cases, Wheeler suggests that we may not want the technology to meet the experiential transparency requirement. It would be better if we were aware that we were using this type of technology when we don't know what the technology is doing or how it classifies information. If it is doing so, let's say, in an obscure or aberrant way. As a proposed solution, rather than incorporation by means of experiential transparency, Wheeler follows Usman Haque and proposes what he calls a model of conversation. The idea is, he says, to create a rapport with the technology through conscious conversations where new possibilities are built on a history of interactions. Such human AI interfaces would be modeled on a constructive, interactive dialogue rather than a smooth, transparent coping. Wheeler puts it this way: in the interactive mode of conversational encounter, the technology in question is not transparent. It's present precisely as another intelligence, and thus gives the position that we have been investigating, the individual's mental machinery, does not extend so as to incorporate that technology. One theoretical drawback for Wheeler, and there's a couple, I think, a dialogical relation with technology would not constitute extended cognition in the way he understands it, or in what he would call the genuine sense, specifically because it fails to meet criteria of experiential transparency and trust. So over and above experiential transparency, the extended mind hypothesis defines, the hypothesis defines criteria of trust, which is equated with automatic endorsement, reliance, and accessibility as necessary for extension or incorporation. So a distrust of a technology rules out the experiential transparency. It's also the case in many technologies that technologies work best when they are transparent. So getting rid of transparency might in fact undermine the very kind of use that we can make of them. There's 2 points that I want to address here. To me, it's not clear that continued or ongoing experiential transparency is a necessary criterion for extended cognition or cognitive integration. For example, if I'm engaged in the use of a technology in an experientially transparent way, such that it constitutes extended cognition on the view of Wheeler and Clark, then I become aware of it. And then when I become aware of it and I add perhaps a level of critical reflection about what am I doing and what is it doing to me, then what I'm doing in that case is simply adding more cognition. It's not that I'm somehow or other undermining the notion of extended cognition here. So it doesn't make it any less cognition or less extended, even if it makes it less experientially transparent. Moreover, my metacognitive critique can be instantiated in social communication, itself an example of extended cognition. Likewise, using my fingers to count, or using pencils and paper to do math, using Otto's notebook, the famous example from Clark, these are all classic instances of extended mind, but they are not necessarily used transparently. If we think of transparency as a lack of consciousness of the cognitive vehicle. The second point, I'm not sure precisely what it means to be in a conversation with technology. Being in conversation with another person can generate new ideas and be a form of the socially extended mind. Moreover, if we accept the distinction between trust and reliability, this is a distinction here that is made by Annette Baer and Kathleen Hawley, where trust pertains to our relations with other people, and reliability or reliance pertains to our relations with artifacts or tools or technologies. If we accept that distinction, then the model of conversation typically involves trust. Our engagement with technology involves reliability. Accordingly, genuine conversation with technology seems a kind of mischaracterization. The idea, or the metaphor, of having a conversation with technology, I think, really clouds the issue. A different proposal is to address the autonomy issue concerning deep learning artificial systems in this way, that with respect to experiential transparency, we can debate whether this is a requirement for extended cognition, but to maintain autonomy, Wheeler may be right that at least for some technologies, we don't want it. We don't want experiential transparency. We want to be aware that we are using dangerous technology or technology that threatens our autonomy. Again, this is a bit of a difficult issue since in some cases technology to work properly really requires something like experiential transparency. What about epistemic transparency? Knowing how the technology works at the design or the physical level. I don't think we need this. And with respect to deep learning artificial intelligence systems, it's not clear that even the engineers know how they actually work. So we could set that aside. Experiential, maybe epistemic, we don't need it. Hermeneutic transparency, however, understanding what the technology does to us, knowing that it may change or hijack our minds, this seems to be a requirement for our ability to critically evaluate our technology use and to guard our autonomy. So I want to take these thoughts and see if we can apply them in areas having to do with therapy. Research areas related to artificial intelligence-guided therapies is moving at a really lightning speed. Here's Fellows et al., 2019. They say, the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in basic research and clinical neuroscience is increasing. AI methods enable the interpretation of large multimedia data sets that can provide unbiased insights into the fundamental principles of brain function. Insights in, potentially paving the way for earlier and more accurate detection of brain disorders and better informed intervention protocols. One example of this could be something like deep brain stimulation. which is sometimes used to treat Parkinson's disease, dystonia, psychiatric disorders such as OCD and depression. Fellows and colleagues explained that one limitation of current deep brain stimulation systems is that they are open loop, which means that the standard DBS chip is unable to monitor and modulate neural activity in real time. In a closed loop design, neurostimulation could be determined by an implanted chip. But then, less than a year after this was written, Alec Widge, a psychiatrist at the University of Minnesota Medical School, described in the popular media the development of a closed-loop technology using AI, which will monitor and sense brain activity moment by moment, millisecond by millisecond. So suddenly, it works in real time. And just within a year, that becomes a development. This kind of technology will be able to read the brain signals and interpret and say, now is the moment when you need to deliver that single little nudge of stimulation to get the network back into its healthy state. Here, we don't really have epistemic transparency. And in contrast to good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, which involved a bottlenecking process of symbol crunching, the more recent combination of deep neural network machine learning with big data allows for the virtualization of models that deliver fast, reliable, and relatively accurate processing with improved weighting of data by backpropagation. Perhaps surprisingly, precisely how this works and why neural networks work as well as they do is, according to Marcus and Davis, an unsolved mystery. Deep learning, they explain, is opaque. But so are the workings of neural networks in the brain. We don't fully understand those either. And most psychiatric medicines, even if we think they work, we're not quite sure how they work. So epistemic transparency isn't available here either. DBS and similar technologies may fall under the category of enhanced rather than extended cognition, but the principles still hold that for user and for therapist, full epistemic transparency is not necessary for them to work. Like psychiatric medications, DBS, as well as the use of AI in creating environments designed to facilitate mental health, can be experientially transparent, and this, as Wheeler suggested, can be dangerous, specifically to the extent that it can block hermeneutic transparency. That is, it can block our understanding of what the technology does to us, knowing that it may change or hijack our minds. Luciana Floridi suggests that even everyday artificial intelligence technologies involve, quote, self-construction, significantly affecting who we are, who we think we are, who we might become, and who we think we might become. And he argues optimistically, I think, that by approaching this reordering of self by means of a concept of information, we can view it as an engineering project of self-construction, where advances in AI are solving the various challenges facing this project. For example, he says, communication, coherence, rationality, successful interaction with the environment, coordination, collaboration with other agents, to mention the most obvious, these are just AI translations of classic issues in the philosophy of the self. In contrast, David Chalmers suggests that the potential consequences of an intelligence explosion force us to think hard about values and morality and about consciousness and personal identity. But we don't have to wait until we reach the singularity, the point at which humans can no longer predict or understand superintelligent systems. AI systems are already epistemically and hermeneutically opaque, so we already need to know whether human identity can survive the enhancing of our cognitive systems. And in the therapeutic context, again, DBS is a good example. although it mostly has positive effects when it addresses things like Parkinson's disease and some of the psychopathologies it's used for. Still, there are side effects, adverse effects in some cases, having to do with reasoning, memory, mood, autonomic processes, changed social relations, feelings of helplessness, loss of meaning in life, increased impulsivity and anger. Most of these things sort of being unaware to the patient, unaware to the subject who's benefiting from the change, but very much seen by friends and by family who have to live with the person in this changed way. So DBS is a technology made more precise by artificial intelligence with experiential transparency, but lacking epistemic and hermeneutic transparency from the patient's perspective, with the possibility of adverse effects on personal identity. We should ask whether this generalizes to other chip implantations, to psychiatric medications, to various uses of AI in therapeutic contexts, such as the use of chat therapy, for example, the classic ELISA that many people would be aware of, and the newer artificial intelligence-assisted applications, for example, primary care evaluation of mental disorders. So here, the last part of this, if I have enough time, I don't know what the time is, 5 minutes, perfect. So one solution, returning to the concept of conversation, but this time I want to talk about human-human conversation rather than human-artificial intelligence conversation. Trust, as I suggested, is a principle of conversation. Hermeneutical a priori, in some cases, one simply enters into conversation a priori understanding that the other person will understand you and communicate with you. Or you can work it out in terms of a kind of trust that you gain through your actual conversation. In any case, all of that can be contrasted with the notion of reliability as it applies to technology. So the suggestion is AI-guided therapies need a kind of meta-guidance by way of conversation between patient, family, and the human therapist, attuned to the potential adverse changes that can occur, aiming for hermeneutic transparency. This can be complicated, of course. For example, in borderline personality disorder, there are problems with intersubjective relations that tend to spill over into the therapeutic context, where some patients mistrust the therapist and resist the therapy, leading to high dropout rates. But a solution is, in fact, can be found in artificial intelligence. AI-supported interventions in the form of, for example, a chat box can address these issues. AI programs in natural language processing, as Zalai puts it, could help patients reauthor their self-narratives into more coherent and meaningful sequences in which they can view themselves more like agents and less subject to external control, as well as assign more consistent roles to others. The chat box asks targeted questions, offers conversational prompts, and processes the effective tone and content coherence. It can mimic a human interaction to supplement sessions with the therapist. Sala notes that patients are more willing to reveal information to virtual humans than to the human therapist. The benefit, it could reduce motivation for the patient's antagonistic responses to the therapist, assuming the patient does not perceive the AI system as a person. But there are more complications to this. The use of AI chat boxes cannot be the complete therapeutic process. That's important because, again, there's a danger of a lack of hermeneutic transparency, since, unlike ELISA, current chat boxes can be designed with with a goal or a trajectory already built in. For example, a belief, desire, intention architecture tends to rigidly stay on course or overcommit to a predetermined goal. And this kind of inflexibility could lead patients to an impersonally predetermined self-construction, a situation that again calls for hermeneutic transparency and human interaction. In these contexts, there is an important trade-off between trust or distrust, whatever the case is, relevant to social interaction, or specifically to human therapist-patient relations, and expectations of reliability in regard to artificial systems or mechanisms. This distinction, based on the idea that in contrast to another person, a piece of technology cannot be dishonest or try to hide something or try to mislead or betray me. It's not clear that by substituting impersonal reliability, which may come with rigidity in the case of AI chat boxes, for example, it's not clear that we gain an improved therapy. And there are some questions about sustainability here, which I'll just skip through for the sake of time and get to my conclusions, which are somewhere up here. Oh, I went too far. My conclusion, I guess maybe, I hope, should be clear at this point anyway, that with respect to therapy, it seems to me that something like human-human interaction still is extremely important, that even if we have good epistemic transparency with the artificial intelligence system that's helping us, and it's more difficult to get the epistemic, for sure, and also the hermeneutical transparency. What can substitute for that, what can substitute for the hermeneutical transparency at least, is the human-human interaction, and therefore, again, the therapy can't simply be based entirely on the artificial processes. Okay, that's good.
Thank you.
The topic of the paper is what inner speech is. And following a one-time student of mine, Daniel Gregory, I'm going to call this the ontological question, the question of what it is, which is in a certain sense one of the fundamental questions in philosophy about inner speech. Obviously, inner speech provokes loads of interesting questions in cognitive science, in linguistics, in psychology, in neuroscience, and in philosophy. But in philosophy, we could just ask the question, what is it exactly? And of course, there's no doubt that we can say what inner speech is up to a point. We can use metaphors like talking in your head or inner voices or something. And we can also use examples to provoke in your mind the phenomenon. Like, for example, I can ask you, where in this particular word here, which I won't say, where does the stress fall in that word? And it seems that if you know that word, you'd be able to answer that question without any kind of, without saying it out loud or anything of the kind. You seem somehow to have that word just before your mind, and you can answer certain questions about it. Likewise, one could ask questions about whether this word means the same as that, whether this word rhymes with some other word, and so on. And these are examples which promote the idea of inner speech. These are examples of inner speech. Of course, we can also use inner speech in other kinds of ways too, where, you know, for example, you're in your hotel room and you're working through your paper, you might use inner speech there too, but you can also use it in simpler cases like that. And then, of course, we can give a kind of provisional characterization of inner speech. We could say, well, you know, you engage in inner speech when you somehow use your linguistic competence in a way that is typically conscious and that lacks a distinctive outward manifestation. That seems to be reasonable up to a point. But what we want to do when we answer the ontological question about inner speech is to be a little bit more explicit and less metaphorical about it. Of course, that's a common thing in philosophy. You ask what something is, you can always say what it is up to a point. The idea is to be more explicit. Okay, so to give you a sense of the options here and why this presents a bit of a problem, What I'll do is I'll just explain two of the most common views in the literature that answer this question. And the first view I'll call the actual speech view. And that view says that inner speech is just like actual speech. It's just, in fact, a certain kind of actual speech. So when you engage in inner speech, you're just performing an ordinary speech act, perhaps of a certain special kind, but just an ordinary speech act. So in a certain sense, it's like the difference between, loud speech and soft speech. Of course, loud speech and soft speech are just both examples of actual speech acts. It's just that one of them has the sort of volume turned down. Well, if you kind of imagine that you turn the volume down the whole way, then you get to inner speech. So that's the sort of actual speech view. And that is really the standard view in the literature on these matters. Here's a quotation from Gregory. Gregory says, "The consensus which has emerged among philosophers working on the topic is that inner speech is a kind of actual speech." So this is the dominant view. But of course, there's a sense in which that dominant view, no matter how plausible it seems to us on the surface, it can't quite be right. And the reason is that when you think about what happens in actual speech, there's something that happens in actual speech which just doesn't happen in inner speech. What happens in actual speech is that you produce an utterance. You actually produce a token sentence or an expression, something that is perceptually available, that you could hear it in a typical case, and that thing that's perceptually available bears important linguistic properties like syntactic properties, semantic properties, phonological properties, and so forth. So there's something in whenever you when you perform a particular speech act, you always produce an utterance of that kind, usually with some intention, for example, to communicate. But that doesn't seem to happen in the case of inner speech. There's just no perceptually available object of that kind. And that means that there's a kind of clear difference between cases of actual speech and cases of inner speech, which means that the actual speech view can't be right. Now, of course, proponents of the actual speech view are kind of aware of this objection and come back and respond in various ways. I'll come back to some of those things at the end. But I want to just sort of start out by saying that so far as I can see, actual speech involves utterances, which means producing a particular token sentence, and that doesn't happen in inner speech, so therefore the actual speech view can't be right. Well, what's an alternative view? Well, an alternative view we can call the imagined speech view. And the imagined speech view basically says that inner speech is imagined speech. It's like when you engage in inner speech, what you're doing is that you imagine speaking or uttering. So in that sense, inner speech is like the kind of inner game of tennis. The inner game of tennis isn't an actual game of tennis. It's just an imagined game of tennis. And likewise, inner speech is just imagined speech. Now there's no sort of conceptual problem with this proposal. We do, in fact, engage in acts of imagination of this sort. You can imagine Churchill saying something, for example. You can imagine being Churchill saying something. You can imagine saying it yourself. There's lots of examples of cases in which you engage in this sort of imagination. But on the other hand, it's hard to believe that this is the sort of typical or certainly not the universal case when we think about inner speech. So for example, when I asked you the question about stress with respect to the word cinema, did you imagine saying it out loud, or was it just that the word somehow was before your mind and you answered the question? It seems to me that the answer is more plausibly of the second kind. Thinking about people who endorse this, Alex, in his book on self-knowledge and transparency, comes quite close to saying this. Alex tells us, when Kylie hears in her internal monologue, and here he's talking about examples of inner speech, what's happening, according to Alex, is that she's in a quasi-perceptual state that represents an utterance of the sentence, "Trees die without water." That's the sentence that Kylie is saying to herself in this example. It's not quite clear exactly what Alex says, so maybe in the Q&A we can find out. But I read him here as saying something like the imagined speech view. Okay, so the imagined speech view, both the actual speech view and the imagined speech view seem to be problematic. I've gone through this already. That the basic problem for this view is that is that while there's certainly something right about this phenomenon, it doesn't seem to be sort of central or typical to cases of inner speech. Okay, you might think that the problem is worse than the one that I've been setting out. What I've said so far is we have the phenomenon, we want to know what it is, we have two theories, and there are problems with both of those theories. Well, that's not terribly surprising, you might say. But maybe we can kind of upgrade the issue from a problem to a paradox by thinking that these two possibilities really exhaust the field. Because you might think, hey, either inner speech is real or it's imagined, and if it's real, then maybe the actual speech view is true, and if it's imagined, well, maybe the imagined speech view is true. So that means it's got to be one or the other, in which case we've got ourselves a kind of paradox, because we want to know what the thing is. We have two theories of what it is, but neither theory is any good, and yet the theories exhaust the options. Okay, so what I want to do in the talk, and what Justin and I want to do, is to try to avoid the paradox and answer the question by describing an alternative, which today I'll call the representational view. I think I mentioned that I could call it the attentional view too. As you'll see, it doesn't matter terribly what the view is called. It comes to the same thing in the end. And the basic idea of the representational view, which I want to put forward today, begins with an idea about what it is to be competent with a language. We know that when you're competent with a language, you obviously have a whole range of capacities. You have a capacity, for example, to perceive and interpret expressions. In fact, a huge number of expressions of the language that you're competent with. But it's plausible to say that you have other kinds of capacities that go along with that. And one capacity that I want to focus on is the capacity to imagine the expressions of the language. By expressions, I just mean the sentences or words or phrases of the language. And I want to think of inner speech as just the exercise of that capacity. So in particular, the representational view that I want to advance is that to engage in inner speech is to imagine, and more generally to represent, the expressions of the language that you're competent in. That's what it is to engage in inner speech from this point of view. Now, obviously, this kind of view is in spirit very much like the imagined speech view that I described earlier and could easily be thought of as a development and generalization of it. Certainly, both views that I've described so far reject the actual speech view entirely. They both say that inner speech can't be a case of actual speech because there's no utterance that's produced. The difference between the representational view, as I'll develop it, and the imagined speech view is that the representational view focuses on a particular kind of imagining, what I'll call object imagining rather than event imagining. That's one difference. And another difference is that the representational view permits that imagining isn't the only way of representing expressions. We can represent the expressions in multiple ways. In fact, one of the features of the view that I want to try to talk about today is that it allows sort of multiple different ways of representing expressions. So long as inner speech is thought of as a way of representing expressions rather than actually producing them, that's the kind of key idea of the representational view. Okay, so in the rest of the paper, I'll have three tasks, basically. The first task is just to explain a little bit more about what the representational view is, and I'll focus on those two views that I mentioned. The first, that it focuses on what is called object imagining rather than event imagining, and the other, that it generalizes to all forms of representing. The second, I want to talk a little bit about the connections between inner speech, language, and consciousness. Obviously, inner speech is a kind of cool topic because it stands at the center of zillions of discussions, some about consciousness, some about language, some about introspection, and so on. And I want to show that the representational view fits in with what you might think of as reasonable general principles in this area. And then finally, I'll come back to the contrast between the representational view and the other two views that I mentioned and go over a little bit more about what the problems are with those views and how this particular view evades those problems. Okay, so first of all, let me talk a little bit about this distinction which I've mentioned between imagining objects and imagining events. Now, in general, when we talk about imagination, we seem to be able to imagine things of multiple different ontological categories. You can imagine an object, you can imagine an event, you can imagine facts, you can imagine situations, and so forth. So, for example, you can imagine that you eat an apple. That, given that you do eat an apple, that might be a fact, or if you're not worrying about whether it's true, that's imagining some sort of proposition to be the case. You can also imagine eating an apple, which is an event. It's something you do. Or perhaps you can just imagine an apple, some object. Okay. So what I want to do is to focus on event imagining and object imagining, leaving the other potential cases of imagination aside. And the key point for the representational view is that imagining, in an important sense, is non-relational, in the sense that it doesn't require the existence of the thing imagined. So, for example, take a case of an apple. You can't eat an apple without there being an apple that you eat. Eating an apple requires the existence of the apple. And the apple in question has to be a particular token apple that you eat. You can't succeed in eating an apple unless there is an apple that you eat. But obviously you can imagine an apple without there being a particular existing apple that you imagine. The same thing can be true for sentences. If you utter a sentence, there's a particular token sentence that you utter. Uttering a sentence is, logically speaking, a bit like eating an apple, or perhaps a bit like throwing an apple. But of course you can imagine a sentence or imagine an expression without there being an expression, a particular token expression that you utter. So you could imagine the expression cinema, for example, without there being a particular token expression that you imagine. Now, if we look at the imagined speech view, the view that I mentioned before, that view focuses a bit uncritically, perhaps, on event imagining. It says that to engage in a speech is to imagine speaking or uttering. It's like imagining Churchill saying something, or you're being Churchill saying something. That's to imagine an event of speaking, or it's to imagine performing a speech act. And actually, I think that's plausibly what generates the problem for the view. The problem for the view, as I mentioned, is not that it's not that, you can't do such a thing. You do such a thing. The question is whether you, for example, answered the question about stress, you imagined performing a speech act. Is that what happened? Or is it simply true that you imagined the word itself? On the representational view, that possibility is permitted, because on that view, you can just imagine an expression itself. You don't need to imagine uttering or saying the expression, producing the expression. Of course, you can do that, and maybe that's going on in some cases, but you don't need to do that. You can also just imagine the expression straight up. Now, there are various objections to this idea. One objection is that you might be concerned that basically you can't imagine events, or imagine objects, without imagining events. So some argue, for example, that when you imagine an apple, you actually imagine perceiving an apple. So you can't actually imagine an apple without imagining perceiving one. Okay. And so by analogy, you might think, well, you can't actually imagine an expression without imagining uttering it or saying it or something like that. But actually, I'm not convinced by that. I think one can imagine an apple entirely unseen, entirely unperceived. It's true you imagine a thing with certain visual properties, but it's not the same as imagining somebody, perhaps you, perceiving it. And so likewise, I think you can imagine a sentence or an expression without imagining uttering that expression. And that means that we have the possibility that I'm interested in available to us. You might also think it's obscure, just what it is to imagine an expression rather than kind of uttering it. But actually, I think when you think about it, this is no different from imagining an apple, something that most of us are more or less happy with. When we imagine an apple, what we're doing is imagining something with a certain range of features, perhaps shape or color, something like that, or position in space relative to you. Likewise, when you imagine an expression, you imagine something with a range of different properties. Okay, so that's what I want to say about object imagining and event imagining. I also want to generalize the picture from imagining to representation. And basically the thought here is that representing and imagining behave very similarly. I've been using the word represent in such a way that you can represent an object even though there's no such object that you imagine. The same thing is true for representation. But I'm going to pass over these issues in the interests of time. I'll also pass over the notion of attention, which all I'm doing here is expanding it to the notion of attention. Let me turn then to the issue of consciousness. I said that inner speech is interesting because lots of issues come together, issues about consciousness and introspection and so forth in the context of language. And I think there's really two issues about inner speech and consciousness that we want to be concerned with. The first is, in what sense are these acts of inner speech themselves conscious? These are acts which I said right at the beginning are sort of in some sense are rather conscious. In what sense are they conscious? And there's an important role for inner speech, which I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about, and that is that inner speech plays a role in rendering cognition or thought itself conscious. That's a second kind of role, second kind of connection between inner speech and consciousness. So I think the important point about the representational view is that it comports with plausible views on these sorts of topics. So let me say something in general about what it is for a state or an act to be conscious. I generally operate with a pretty kind of general and abstract notion of consciousness, where we can say that a state or an act of a person is conscious just in case it has enough of the following properties. The first property is phenomenal character, that there's something it's like for the subject to be in it. The second is attentional engagement, that the subject of the state must attend in some ways, typically to the content of the state. The third is that the functional role of the state has to be enhanced in certain ways. This is very close to Dennett's idea of cerebral celebrity, the idea of that in a conscious state, the functional role is broader than it would otherwise be. And a final property is that the state itself must be somehow open to introspection. The subject who's in the state must be able to know by introspection that they're in it. These are features of a state that I think go into the idea that it's conscious. But I don't want to require that a conscious state in every case has all of these features, simply that it has enough of these features. Now, if we think of acts of inner speech, they're conscious mostly because they have all of these features. When you imagine a sentence, that's actually very like perceiving a sentence or even uttering a sentence. And it's like it in a whole range of ways, simply because imagining something is rather like doing it. So that's the sense in which acts of inner speech themselves are conscious. They have all of these features. I go through this in more detail in the paper, but I'll pass over that as well, because I want to get to the point about cognition or thought. Because here there's a problem about how cognitive states, like states of belief or knowledge, can be conscious. But actually the account of consciousness that I just mentioned applies to those as well. And at least it applies to those if we assume that states of belief can have these four features, that a state of belief can be conscious just in case it has enough of these four features. Now, in the case of belief, it's actually controversial whether it has the first feature. The position that Uriah Kriegel calls mainstream stinginess says that beliefs never have phenomenal character. And for the moment, I'm going to assume that that's true. Beliefs never have phenomenal character, so therefore they don't have the first property that's required for a state to be conscious. But that doesn't mean that a state can't be conscious on this kind of picture, because it can have enough of the other features and that'll count as a conscious state. Now, in the case of beliefs, it's plausible that it has the second feature. That is, when a belief is conscious, you attend to some sufficient degree to the content of that belief. And moreover, it's plausible actually that that property in the case of belief is not just necessary for a state to be conscious, but it's sufficient as well. And the reason for that is that the second two properties that I've mentioned here, enhancement of functional role and openness to introspection, those plausibly depend on the first two properties. So a state will have an enhanced functional role or will be open to introspection, basically because it engages your attention in a particular way. So here I want to say, okay, we're going to think about beliefs and and states of knowledge and ask in what ways they're conscious. And what I wanted to say in this case is that attentional engagement is the key property that a state has to have, a state of that kind, for it to be conscious. So we can say more simply that a cognitive state or an act is conscious if and only if its subject attends to some sufficient extent to its content. So to take a simple example, suppose you believe that Biden is president. You believe it consciously, that means that belief state is conscious, just in case you attend to some sufficient degree to the content of that state. That is, the state of affairs that, were it to obtain, would make that belief true. And that's also true in more complicated cases. So suppose you believe not that Biden is president, but something complicated like, Biden is president unless he dies in office, in which case Harris will be. That's a more complicated belief, but once again, that belief can be conscious if you attend to a sufficient extent to its content, to the state of affairs that, if true, would render that belief correct. But basically, in order for beliefs to be conscious in that way, we need some sort of mechanism of attention. We need some way of attending to the contents of your beliefs to render them conscious. In order for this picture of consciousness to apply to beliefs, it must be that you can attend to the contents, which means you need some mechanism of attention. And in linguistic creatures, one of the main mechanisms is plausibly language. That means we can attend to the content of our beliefs by attending to expressions that capture or partially capture those contents. Now, obviously, this can happen in outer speech. One way of making states of belief and knowledge conscious is by talking them over with your friends. That's a good thing to do, and it renders them conscious. But it can also happen in inner speech as well, and it can also happen in inner speech just given the representational view. So in outer speech, what happens is that you produce certain utterances. There actually are utterances. There actually are perceptually available objects. But those are objects of attention, and they help you to attend to the contents of the beliefs that you have. But the same thing can be true in inner speech, but in that case, you don't actually utter any sentences or expressions. You simply attend to the relevant expressions or imagine the relevant expressions that express the contents in question. Okay, let me, in the final parts of the talk, just turn back to the actual speech view and to the imagined speech view. So earlier I rejected the actual speech view on the ground that basically there are no perceptual objects of the kind that the actual speech view requires. No token sentences in the case of inner speech. But of course, as I mentioned, there may be replies to this objection, and moreover, there may well be persuasive arguments for the actual speech view that I haven't talked about. So let me say something about these issues. So first, in terms of defending the actual speech view, you could, of course, defend the actual speech view by saying, yes, there are, in fact, perceptually available sentences in cases of inner speech. It's just that they're not physical sentences, they're mental sentences in your mind, and you can perceive them with inner perception. Well, Alex actually in his book has a nice discussion of this, and he says something along the lines of, this is no better than postulating mental apples in the case of hallucination. So in the case in which you hallucinate an apple in front of you, there's a strong temptation to think that there might be a mental apple that's before your mind that somehow corresponds to the physical apple out in the world, or in the case of hallucination, fails to correspond. We don't want to fall into the trap of doing that in the case of inner speech. And of course, the representational view allows us to not fall into that trap because it just says, well, all that's happening is that we're imagining a sentence. It's not the case that there is a sentence, and definitely not a mental sentence of the kind that you might go for in that kind of view. Another line of thought that people use to defend the actual speech view is that they say, well, maybe it's not really a matter of producing a sentence in the case of inner speech. Maybe it's a kind of case of failed production, where you sort of initiate the proceedings to produce the outer sentence, but you actually don't. It's sort of somehow the causal pathways stop and nothing actually gets produced. My reaction to that is something like, yes, that can certainly happen in some cases, but I don't think, again, that can be typical of cases of inner speech that we have in mind. For one thing, intentions to produce of that kind are often unconscious, and we've been focusing on episodes that are conscious. And another thing is that that doesn't seem to be phenomenologically accurate when you think about questions like, you know, where does the stress fall in the word cinema? It's not clear that you initiated proceedings to produce that sentence and then somehow that causal pathway just didn't reach its terminus. Of course, there are arguments for the actual speech view. One argument is that inner speech is phenomenally like outer speech, so it must be a case of actual speech given that outer speech is. Another argument is that inner speech renders thought conscious, just like outer speech does. Hence, it can be a kind of outer speech. I think I have some good answers to those objections. A third objection, which I think is a third argument for the actual speech view that I think needs some further thought, and maybe you have some views about, is this idea. We seem to feel in introspection strongly that inner speech has sort of illocutionary force, that you can perform assertions in inner speech or ask questions in inner speech, just like you can in outer speech. And if that's true, then it looks as if we need to have something like the actual speech view to be true. From my point of view, this kind of must be illusory. It can't be true that we actually perform assertions or ask questions in inner speech. Of course, it's true that we can do things that are very like that. We can have exactly the psychological profile of somebody who's asserting something or asking a question in inner speech, but we can't actually produce an object, produce a perceptually available object, which is a sentence. We can, of course, imagine a sentence and render the states of belief or wondering or whatever they are conscious, but we can't, in fact, perform acts. We can't, in fact, perform speech acts in inner speech as we can in outer speech. So finally, let me say something about the imagined speech view. Earlier, I rejected that view on the ground that it emphasised event imagining rather than object imagining. That's the key difference. I don't want to say that you can't engage in event imagining, and I don't want to even deny that certain cases of event imagining might be classified as inner speech. I just wanted to emphasise that there's certain cases of object imagining which are different from cases of event imagining and which, in many cases of inner speech, seem to be the kinds of episodes that are going on. On the other hand, the representational view is obviously a close cousin of this kind of imagined speech view, so therefore you might think it faces the same kind of objections. Well, what are the objections? Well, here's two objections. The first is that inner speech allows you to answer factual questions about your language, but you might be concerned that imagination doesn't really allow you to answer factual questions, at least not of that sort. So, for example, it's a factual question about where the stress falls in that word. Inner speech seems to allow you to answer that question, which means you might think just imagining the thing doesn't help you answer that question. So therefore, the imagined speech view can't be true. I think the response to that is that imagination in this case, I think, doesn't play a kind of evidential role with respect to this question. It doesn't really provide you evidence for the answer to this question. What it might do is make available to you an answer that you somehow already knew. But that's actually part and parcel of the representational view anyway. The whole point of the representational view is that it can render states of knowledge conscious. So here one can say is that you basically already knew the answer to the question of where the stress fell in that particular word, and all that happened in the speech is that that piece of knowledge became conscious. It had, if you like, a wider functional role than it would ordinarily have, and that's what inner speech did for it. But it's not the case that imagination provides you evidence for some answer to a factual question. A second objection to the imagined speech view, which you come across quite a lot, is that you don't just think about language, you think with it. And that's actually what the interesting thing about inner speech is. Inner speech is a kind of use of language that seems very, very common and natural for us, and we would describe it by saying that we're just thinking in language. It's not like we're linguists thinking about language, we're sort of thinking with it. And that's the phenomenon of inner speech. And you might think the imagined speech view doesn't really capture that phenomenon. And the same thing, of course, would apply to the view that I've just been describing. On the other hand, that language can render your thought conscious. And once your thought is conscious, it's more easily accessible. It has a wider effect on the rest of your mind than it would otherwise do. And it's true on the representational view, and indeed on the imagined speech view, that inner speech plays that role. So in a sense, we can say, on this view, inner speech does indeed, it is such that we think with it rather than simply about it. But that's true on the representational view as well. Okay, so let me draw some conclusions and then I'll finish. So basically there are 4 things that I've been trying to put across to you. The first is that to engage in inner speech is, on this sort of view, to imagine expressions. You have a capacity for inner speech, is just a capacity to imagine expressions. To acts of inner speech are simply exercises of that capacity. And as I mentioned, that's a capacity which I think we have just as ordinary speakers of a language. It's not just imagining, as I mentioned, it could be generalized to representation or attention, but I didn't really go through that in the presentation. Now, if it is to imagine expressions in this particular way, then it's not to utter expressions, as it would be on the actual speech view, and it's not to mentally utter them. That would be the equivalent of thinking that there are mental apples in the case of hallucination. And it's not to unsuccessfully utter them. That means to initiate the process of uttering them, but that process never reaches its termination. There are such processes, but that doesn't seem to be the key thing in the case of inner speech. And nor is it to imagine uttering them. I'm much more friendly to that last possibility. All I want to say about that last possibility is that it doesn't seem to be the typical kind of case. I also said that acts of inner speech are themselves conscious. They're conscious because they have the properties of acts that are required for them to be conscious. They have phenomenal character, attentional engagement, width of functional role, and are open to introspection. And I also said that acts of inner speech render beliefs conscious. Beliefs are conscious in a more limited way. They're typically conscious because you attend to the contents of the beliefs. But in order for that to be the case, it must be that there's a mechanism of attention, and language provides that mechanism of attention, and inner speech does too on this picture. And finally, I said that the representational view avoids the pitfalls of the other views. And the main pitfall in the case of the actual speech view is that in that view, acts of inner speech are modelled entirely on acts of outer speech. But the thing is that acts of outer speech require you to utter a sentence. That means actually producing a token sentence, which is a perceptually available object that bears interesting linguistic properties, and there's no such thing in the case of inner speech, so therefore it can't be actual speech. So that's the representational view. Thanks.